Lovely, thanks so much. A big thank you to Bologna for organizing this, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for your work across the board on this issue. So as was mentioned, my name is Darya Dolzikova. I'm a researcher with the Royal United Services Institute. We're based out of London. We're a defense and security think tank. We cover a range of defense and security issues. I sit with our proliferation nuclear policy team and work on a range of subjects related to nuclear policy, nuclear safety, security, non-proliferation, kind of cover the gamut. Over the last few years, I've been really honing in on Rosatom's work, as well as the situation in Ukraine, the nuclear safety security situation in Ukraine, which obviously are very closely interrelated. A lot of my work covers the Iran nuclear program as well, which, as was just mentioned, involves Rosatom as well, in the construction of the Bushehr power plants, which is the civilian side of the Iranian program, but nevertheless has raised some concerns around Russian involvement in the country. So what I figured I would do today was, I was going to talk quickly about Russia's nuclear exports, its presence in the conversion space. Dmitri's done that much better than I can. So what I figured I would do is I'd skip over that and go straight to the subject that I've really spent the last couple of years really focusing in on, which is Russia's presence in global enrichment markets, uranium enrichment markets. And this is, I think, a subject that has personally interested me, but also is an area where Western governments can really, I think, make a dent when it comes to cutting dependence on Russian supply in the nuclear sector. So I'm going to zero in. Dmitry touched on it briefly already. I'm going to hone in a little bit more in detail on what it is that we're actually talking about. So you'll see the graph there on estimated global imports of enriched uranium from Russia between 2019 and 2023 by a range of countries. This is in US dollars. Now, actually tracking the volume and value of Russian exports of enriched uranium to global markets is notoriously challenging because Russia doesn't actually report its exports in enriched uranium. It's by no stretch the only country that doesn't do that, but it makes our jobs as researchers a lot more difficult. So the way that I've approached it is to look at imports by countries that we know import from Russia, wherever that data is available. So you'll see the graph there. I appreciate it's a little bit small. You'll find all of these graphs in the publication that we put out on this subject last year. That's all available on our website. I linked to it at the end as well. But it should give you a bit of an idea of where the greatest imports are of enriched uranium, of Russian enriched uranium. So in 2022, Rosatom accounted for an estimated 44% of operational enrichment capacity globally. So it's by far the biggest supplier of enrichment capacity in the world. In 2023, Russia accounted for just under 38% of enrichment services supplied to European Union utilities, and just over 27% of enrichment services purchased by US utilities. So in both those instances, it is again by far the largest foreign supplier of enrichment services to both those markets. And as you'll see, the biggest imports of enriched uranium or enriched uranium services, and you sort of have to distinguish those two. I won't go into too much detail as to why, but we separate enrichment services from actual enriched uranium when we're looking at this data, is to China, France, and the United States. And that remains the case. It's remained the case since 2022. And I'll go into a bit more detail, particularly on the French and Chinese cases. In the case of the US, those numbers are a little bit tricky because some of that material gets shipped back out. So the purchases of enriched uranium services, there's some feed that's exported back out. So it's a little bit difficult to actually hone in on the specific value of the imports into the United States. Again, if we want to go into more detail as to why that is, we can in the panel discussion, or it's outlined in the report. But notwithstanding, there is a large amount of enriched uranium that's coming into the United States from Russia. So this is a graph of enriched uranium imports into Europe. It is an important market for Russian enriched uranium services. And as you'll see, there's been some shifts since 2022 as to where the enriched uranium is actually imported to in Europe from Russia. So previously there was a large amount being imported into Sweden. That drops off to zero in 2022. I think there was a little import kind of in January, I think, or early February of 2022, and then it stops completely, with continued imports primarily into France, Germany, and the Netherlands, some imports into Spain. Now, for those that are familiar with nuclear fuel cycles, those countries will not be particularly surprising because that's where nuclear fuel production happens. And nuclear fuel production in those countries happens not just for those countries, but for export onto other markets across Europe and across the world. So Sweden, the Swedish utilities stopped using Russian enriched uranium for their fuel production. Sweden used to also, or still does, produce fuel for other markets as well, including France and other countries, Ukraine as well. But they've stopped all imports of Russian enriched uranium in 2022. And you see a spike after 2022 into France, and particularly in 2024 into Germany, where again, there are fuel fabrication facilities. So this raises a couple of questions as to why is France needing almost a 200% increase, I think it was in 2022, of Russian enriched uranium. How can we explain this? So this is a quote that I pulled out after a little bit of digging from reporting in Le Monde in the French newspaper that said that actually France has not, or the French utility EDF has not increased its share of the use of Russian enriched uranium in its fuel production. So what that says to me is that this spike in imports into France is not for French, not necessarily for use in French reactors. As I mentioned, in France, there are fuel production facilities that produce nuclear fuel for reactors in other countries as well. So there's a few different reasons for why there might have been the spike into France. One of them might be that other utilities that use France for their fuel production were stockpiling. They were trying to get this enriched uranium to the fuel production facility in France in advance of any sanctions that might have come on that they might have been expecting. The other explanation for it is that there are a number of countries that, like I said, had stopped taking in Russian enriched uranium. So there was no more imports into Sweden, where, like I said, a few different countries were producing nuclear fuel for their reactors. The United Kingdom is an interesting case because they don't actually report imports of enriched uranium. So it makes it quite difficult to figure out whether there have been any changes in imports into the United Kingdom. However, in July 2022, they introduced a 35% tariff on imports of various isotopes and compounds from Russia. So that would have included enriched uranium. So if you can no longer, or if it becomes very expensive to import enriched uranium into the United Kingdom, if we see trade data dropping down in Sweden on imports of Russian enriched uranium into Sweden, that leaves three fuel production facilities in Europe. That leaves Spain, France, and Germany for fuel production fabrication for reactors in Europe and elsewhere that these facilities export to. So that to me is probably the most likely explanation of these spikes. It's a reallocation across the market. There's some flexibility in markets. So if there's no more imports coming into Sweden or the UK, the UK again, the data is missing, but presumably 35% tariff is a bit off-putting. So there's movement into other fuel fabrication facilities. The point being that these markets are quite flexible. So when we have countries like the UK putting in certain restrictions, like this 35% tariff, that doesn't mean that stops Russian enriched uranium imports into Europe. There is a little bit of flexibility, so it can move around the market a little bit. It's limited, it's not full flexibility. Nevertheless, I think this stresses the importance of a multilateral approach. Just because a single country takes measures doesn't mean that material can't enter European markets or otherwise through other doors. So I think it again highlights the importance of a multilateral approach. Another case which is quite interesting is the case of China. Dmitry already mentioned this briefly, but there was quite a significant increase of imports, both in US dollar amounts and in the actual volume into China from Russia. So we see this in 2022, persists through 2023, huge spike in 2024, The data for 2025 is just for the first 3 months, but we still see that there are still imports coming into China. So again, a couple of different possibilities. China is building nuclear reactors like it's nobody's business. So perhaps they're importing enriched uranium for their own use, for their own reactors, but they have their own enrichment capability and capacity as well. Perhaps they're stockpiling for future need for the Chinese as well. That's one potential explanation. The Chinese nuclear sector, more so even than the European one, is a bit of a black box. So doing research into where this material actually goes in China and what happens to it is a little bit tricky. But that's one potential explanation. But I think a particularly convincing explanation is when you look at Chinese exports of enriched uranium to the United States in particular. We see a massive spike in 2023 and 2024. I've not seen any data for exports in 2025 yet. That doesn't mean that it's not coming, but a massive increase in 2023 and 2024. And I had tried to find where those exports were going to, and if I'm not mistaken, they were going to fuel fabrication facilities in the United States. So that to me raises the possibility of potential displacement, right? So if the Chinese are keen to do greater business on global markets, on global enriched uranium markets, which we know they are, they're keen to become, as Mitri had mentioned, a much bigger player in global nuclear supply chains, both in the construction of reactors, but also in the provision of nuclear enrichment services, uranium enrichment services. Then one possibility is if countries won't take Russian enriched uranium, the Chinese will take it. That frees up a little bit of domestic capacity to then export Chinese enriched uranium to global markets. It's a hypothesis. I have no proof that that's actually the displacement that's happening. But I think the evidence points to the fact that these kinds of questions need to be asked. The United States has, in the fall, I think it was in September, perhaps a bit earlier, opened up an investigation to look into whether this kind of displacement is actually happening. Very difficult to track because, again, you're having to figure out where the enriched uranium is going inside of China and where this export of enriched uranium is coming from. So it's a bit hard to track that inside of China to prove whether any kind of displacement is actually going on. But it is a question that I've certainly asked and that the United States government has been looking into as well to see if displacement is actually taking place. So what does all of this mean? Russian presence within nuclear supply chains is extensive. So it's not just segregated to a particular part of the supply chain. It covers everything from, as we've already discussed, presence in the uranium mining sector, in the construction of nuclear reactors, in the export of nuclear fuel, conversion, enrichment services, reprocessing, etc. Alternatives to Russian supply are available across the supply chain. So again, we've already discussed that there are other fabricators of reactors of nuclear fuel that's fit for VVER reactors, of conversion and enrichment services. However, they are currently a little bit limited in certain parts of the nuclear fuel cycle in their capacity. When it comes to nuclear reactor exports, the Russians are really the main ones that are exporting reactors at the moment. There are a few others. The French, for instance, are building reactors abroad as well, but not at the scale and pace that Russia is doing so. China is trying to get into the market as well. When it comes to uranium enrichment, there's also an expansion of capacity in Europe, an effort to expand capacity in the United States as well. The expansion is going a lot quicker in Europe than it is in the United States, but nevertheless, there are efforts in place. However, we're still not quite there where alternative enrichment capacity can replace Russian enriched capacity. My understanding is that that transition, technically speaking, in terms of capacity that's available, will be easier in Europe than it is in the United States. The US is still kind of working to ratchet up capacity a bit, but it is a process. There are regulatory, political, and commercial considerations that are complicating diversification away from Russia. Like I said, there's some flexibility across markets, but it is limited. You can ship enriched uranium to a different fuel production facility if you already have some enriched uranium going to that production facility as a utility to get your fuel produced elsewhere. However, for things like the construction of nuclear reactors or the production of VVER fuel, you need to certify with a new supplier if you're going to do that. That's a very lengthy and complicated process. as it should be. However, it does challenge diversification and moving away from established suppliers. And as Russia gets squeezed out of some parts of the nuclear market, its nuclear sector will adapt. So again, we're seeing some of this adaptation by the looks of it in Europe, by the moving around of where enriched uranium is delivered, or by the stockpiling of enriched uranium in advance of any expected sanctions. That is all a natural adaptation by businesses in the nuclear fuel sector. However, again, it does highlight that if there is going to be a move to try to clamp down on some of those dependencies on Russian enriched uranium and other supplies, it can't be a unilateral country by country effort. It does need to be a multilateral effort to close all available doors, if that's really what we're trying to do. And my expectation is that Rosatom will look to essentially increase its presence in other parts of the nuclear fuel cycle, or as was mentioned earlier, in other industries altogether, to try to make up for the challenges it's facing in certain parts of the nuclear fuel cycle. So, what are options for addressing persistent dependencies? We need to incentivize, be it uranium enrichment providers or conversion service providers or nuclear power plant construction companies, suppliers, with competitive government incentives and, importantly, long-term demand signals, both from government and from industry. This is a very, very resource-intensive, regulation-intensive industry. So if suppliers think that in 2 years from now, if sanctions are put in or restrictions are put in, and then in 2 years from now, that's all lifted, there's very little incentive to put in the upfront costs in setting up new enrichment capacity or entering new markets for reactor construction or nuclear fuel production. So there need to be long-term assurances and demand signals, both from government, but also from industry. I've stressed this a few times, but multilateral restrictions on imports of Russian material, it can't be a one-off thing. Like I said, the United Kingdom has put in a 35% tariff. There's other doors for that enriched uranium to enter European markets. So it does really need to be a multilateral effort. The pursuit of possible cases of ban circumventions and strengthening of verification capabilities. So I talked about the potential for displacement through China. Like I said, the United States is already looking into whether this is actually happening, because if it is, then that would be in circumvention of the bans that are in place in the United States on imports of Russian enriched uranium. Would be considered a circumvention tactic. So the need to pursue these instances and to identify ways of strengthening verification capabilities. So how do you actually track this material? What kind of information do we search from governments? To assess and address dependency on Russia across the nuclear fuel supply chain. My work focused largely on the enriched uranium aspect of the supply chain, but as we've discussed, the Russian presence runs across the full nuclear fuel cycle. So cutting them out of one doesn't necessarily mean that they won't sort of move into other parts of the sector. And then importantly, highlighting the risks of Russian presence in countries' energy supply chains. Because oftentimes for political reasons, countries will say, well, actually, I just need a supplier. The Russians can build a whole power plant for me. They'll operate it for me. They'll take my spent fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So highlighting the risks that exist in building up dependencies on Russia is important to make clear to those countries why kind of putting all their eggs in the Russian basket is not necessarily the smartest idea from an energy security perspective, perhaps. And then avoiding trading dependencies on Russia for dependencies on other suppliers. So again, we see this additional import into the United States of Chinese enriched uranium. That to me does not seem like the most sensible diversification tactic. So looking at potentially more sort of quote unquote dependable, friendly suppliers as an alternative. And further open source reporting and greater transparency in nuclear fuel supply chains. I mean, Bologna will know this well. I experienced trying to track these nuclear fuel cycle flows of enriched uranium. It is a headache and a half to try to pull all of this together. I think I can certainly speak for RUSI's work. It's had a lot of interest from industry, from governments. I expect it's been the same for Bologna. So this work does actually have a lot of uptake, and it's really, really important. There's others in the space doing it as well. So continuing to do this kind of work, the kind of work that Bologna is doing, is really important as well. We've got some more work on the subject on our webpage. We've done some work on Russian activity at Ukrainian nuclear facilities. All of that is on our webpage, which you can find there, and my email address is at the bottom if there's any questions. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Darya.